The whole town of Harlan Creek said Sallie Wells was the kind of woman who would wear a man down to nothing, and not a single one of them understood that she considered it a compliment. It was the spring of 1878 in the New Mexico Territory, and the air still carried the bite of a winter that had refused to leave gracefully. The cottonwood trees along the creek were just beginning to green up, their pale leaves trembling in a wind that came down hard from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and swept through the main street of Harlan Creek like it owned the place. Sallie Wells stood outside the general store, owned by a man named Dolph Prout, who had just told her for the third time in as many weeks that he would not be extending her any more credit. And she was looking at him with those steady brown eyes of hers in a way that made him feel considerably smaller than his considerable frame suggested he ought to feel. She was 26 years old, lean and sun-browned from working the small parcel of land her father had left her when he passed the previous autumn. With dark hair she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. She was not the most beautiful woman in the territory, though she was striking in the way that certain landscapes are striking, not soft and pleasant but arresting, the kind of face you kept looking at because you felt it was telling you something important if you could only figure out what. She had a mouth that was built for opinions and a mind that was built for argument, and she had never in her life accepted a situation simply because someone older or louder than her said that was the way things were. "You will not extend me credit," she said to Dolph Prout, repeating his words back to him in the calm, deliberate way she had, "because you believe I cannot pay. Is that right?" Dolph shifted his weight from one boot to the other. He was a fleshy man with a red neck and small eyes, and Sallie's gaze always made him feel like she was reading the figures in his ledger right through his forehead. "It ain't personal, Sallie. It is business. You have got $63 outstanding already, and your harvest was poor last fall on account of the drought." "My harvest was poor because the drought hit everyone in the valley equally," she said. "And every man in this valley who came to you with the same outstanding balance was offered a new line of credit because you believed their word was good. Now that is not entirely. Thomas Aldridge owes you $90. Jim Cutter owes you $70. Neither of them have a crop in the ground yet, and you extended both of them last week. I know this because Thomas told me himself, probably figuring I would not put the facts together in a straight line." She tilted her chin up slightly. "I am asking for $40 of seed credit so I can plant my north field and my west quarter. I will pay it back by September with interest at whatever rate you charge the men." Dolph's small eyes moved around the street behind her, as if looking for someone to rescue him from this conversation. He found no one. "Sallie," he said finally, with the tone of a man who believed he was being very patient, "a woman alone on 40 acres is not the same kind of risk as a man with a family depending on." "A woman alone on 40 acres, she said, and her voice was very quiet now, which was always when it was most dangerous, "is exactly the same kind of farmer as a man on 40 acres. The dirt does not know the difference. Neither does the rain. And neither, I expect, will my money when I bring it to you in September." She walked away before he could answer, because she had learned that the most powerful thing she could do in this town was refuse to wait for permission to end a conversation. She heard him calling after her, something about how she needed to understand the way things worked, and she kept walking and did not turn around, and her jaw was set in the way it got when she was working very hard to keep something painful from showing on her face. The truth was that she was frightened, not of Dolph Prout, who was a small man in a large body, but of the numbers. She had done the figures 3 times on the back of an envelope the night before by lamplight, and 3 times they had come out the same. Without seed for the north field, she could grow enough on her remaining planted acres to eat through winter, but not enough to pay down what she owed. And by spring of 1879, Dolph Prout would have sufficient legal grounds to make her life considerably more complicated. She needed that credit. She needed it, and she had asked for it honestly and been refused. And now, she walked down the packed dirt street of Harlan Creek with her spine straight and her face composed, and her mind working furiously on what came next. What came next turned out to be Hattie Bowman, who was sitting on the bench outside the telegraph office, and who waved at Sallie with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a woman who had been married for 22 years to the same cheerful man, and had consequently never developed the layer of defensive dignity that single life in a small town required of women like Sallie. Hattie was 51, round-faced, with silver hair and a warmth about her that Sallie privately thought was the most valuable thing in Harlan Creek. She was also the postmistress and the telegraph operator, and consequently knew everything that happened in the territory before anyone else did, a fact she was refreshingly honest about. "I heard Prout turned you down again," Hattie said. Sallie sat down beside her on the bench. "Who told you?" "Thomas Aldridge's wife, who heard it from Prout himself, who apparently found the whole thing very unsettling and needed to tell someone." Hattie folded her hands in her lap. "He said you asked too much of him." Sallie looked out at the street. A wagon loaded with lumber was rolling slowly past, pulled by two dusty brown horses. "He said I asked too much," she repeated. "He did." "And do you want to know what I told Margaret Aldridge when she told me that?" "I expect you will tell me whether I want to know or not." "I told her that a woman who knows what she needs and asks for it plainly is not asking too much. She is simply refusing to ask too little." Hattie patted Sallie's hand. "There is a difference between demanding the unreasonable and refusing to accept less than what is fair." Sallie looked at the older woman for a moment, and something in her face shifted just slightly, some small controlled thing that she did not usually let people see. "It is exhausting, Hattie," she said quietly. "I am so tired of having to argue for the right to simply exist as I am." "I know it. My father left me that land because he trusted me with it. He knew I could work it. He watched me work it beside him for 15 years. And this whole town looks at me and sees a problem to be solved by marriage." "They do," Hattie agreed. "Most of them mean well enough." "I know they mean well. That almost makes it worse." Sallie stood up, settling her hat more firmly on her head. "I am going to figure this out myself." She did not figure it out easily, and the weeks that followed were some of the harder ones she could remember. She planted what she could with what she had left from the previous year's seed stores, worked from first light to last light, and spent her evenings in the small house her father had built going over her accounts with the concentrated ferocity of someone who believed that if she stared at the numbers hard enough, they would eventually rearrange themselves into something more agreeable. They never did, but she did not stop staring. The thing about Sallie Wells that the men in Harlan Creek could not quite get their minds around, the thing that made them shake their heads and use phrases like too much and too difficult and too particular, was that she did not want to be rescued. She had been very clear about this. When Roy Hendricks had proposed to her the previous year, she had asked him, politely but directly, whether he expected she would give up the land or keep it. When he had said that naturally she would keep the land, as it would become part of his holdings, she had thanked him for making his position so clear and declined. When he had stared at her in bafflement and asked what on earth she was looking for, she had said, simply, "Someone who sees the land as mine, not as an addition to what is already his. Someone who would work beside me, not above me." Roy Hendricks had walked away shaking his head and told anyone who would listen that Sallie Wells had asked too much of a man. The phrase followed her around like a faithful but unwanted dog. She was described, in the warm and certain tones of people who had decided something and saw no reason to reconsider it, as a woman who asked too much independence, too much respect, too much say over her own life. She asked for partnership when she ought to have wanted protection. She asked for equality when she ought to have been grateful for provision. She asked for a man who would look at her and see a person rather than a problem, and that, apparently, was the most unreasonable ask of all. The story of Sallie Wells and her impossible expectations had traveled the way stories travel in small western towns, which is to say in every direction and at remarkable speed. It reached the ears of a man named Cobb Fletcher, who ran the livery in a town called Dusty Fork some 30 miles northeast of Harlan Creek, and Cobb mentioned it to a drifting cattle hand who came through in late April, and that cattle hand mentioned it in a saloon in Cimarron, and the story kept moving, growing slightly with each telling in the way of all good stories, until it was less of a story and more of a reputation, and the reputation was this: that there was a woman in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, who had her own land and her own mind and her own rules, and who had turned down every man in the valley because not one of them had been willing to give her what she actually deserved. Wesley Whitaker heard this story on a Wednesday evening in late May of 1878, sitting at a corner table in a saloon in Cimarron, and he heard it from a man named Pete Dobbins, who told it with the laughing, pitying tone of someone who found the whole situation amusing. Pete thought the woman sounded difficult. Pete thought any woman who turned down solid prospects was fooling herself. Pete said a woman alone on 40 acres in this territory was going to learn a hard lesson about the value of practical choices before long. Wesley Whitaker listened to all of this without saying anything, which was how he usually listened to things. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered, angular face that came from spending a decade working cattle drives from Texas up through the territory. A face that had seen too much sun and too little kindness, and had consequently developed a certain quiet quality, as if it had decided long ago to give nothing away for free. He had dark eyes that were very still and attentive, and hands that were rough and capable, and he had not, in his entire adult life, sat still in one place for longer than 3 months at a stretch. He had money saved. A fair amount of it, actually, accumulated over 10 years of driving cattle for other men, and spending very little because there was never anywhere particular he wanted to spend it. He had looked at land 3 or 4 times over the years and always found some reason to keep moving. He told himself it was because the right piece hadn't come along yet. But if he was honest, and he was the kind of man who was very honest with himself in quiet moments, the real reason was that settling somewhere permanent required a level of commitment to a future he could not quite imagine, and he could not imagine it because he had spent his entire adult life being useful to other people's ambitions rather than his own. He had grown up the second of 4 sons on a struggling ranch in West Texas, which meant he had learned early that the available affection and resources were divided 4 ways, and that his particular portion was small. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to ask for nothing, to take up as little space as possible. He had been told, in the gentle but constant way that families communicate their expectations without ever stating them plainly, that he was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who would make do with whatever was left. He had never in his life looked at something he wanted, something that was genuinely, personally his own, and said, "I deserve this. I am going to reach for it." He had been giving too little his entire life. Too little of himself, too little of his real thoughts, too little of what he actually wanted. He had poured everything he had into work that was other men's, stood back and watched other men claim things he might have claimed, and told himself this was modesty or practicality or patience, when actually it was just fear. The fear of someone who had learned young that wanting things out loud only made the inevitable disappointment worse. But now he was sitting in a corner of a saloon in Cimarron, New Mexico, on a Wednesday evening in May of 1878, and a man named Pete Dobbins was laughing about a woman 30 miles away, who apparently had the outrageous expectation that a man should offer her actual partnership, real equality, genuine respect, and Pete Dobbins thought this was ridiculous, and something in Wesley Whitaker's chest moved in a way that things did not usually move. He thought about what Pete had said she wanted, someone who would work beside her, not above her, someone who saw the land as hers, someone who was willing to give, not just to take. He sat with his glass and he thought about it for a long time, long after Pete Dobbins had moved on to other company, and then he thought about it some more on the ride back to the bunkhouse where he was staying. He lay on his bunk in the dark and stared at the low ceiling and thought about a woman he had never met who was apparently asking for the exact thing he had never known how to offer anyone. It was not a simple decision. He turned it over in his mind for 3 days, which was longer than he had spent deciding anything in recent memory. He thought about all the reasons it made no sense to ride 30 miles to introduce himself to a woman, based on a second-hand story told by a man who clearly did not understand her at all. He thought about how it would look and what she might think, and whether a woman who had turned down every man in her valley would have any interest whatsoever in a cattle hand from Texas who had no property and no particular plan. And then on the 3rd day, which was a Saturday, he got up before dawn and saddled his horse, a steady roan gelding he had owned for 4 years and named Button for no reason he could clearly articulate, and he rode southwest toward Harlan Creek. He rode for most of the morning, following a trail that crossed the Cimarron River and wound through the high grass and sage of the territory, with the mountains large and blue to the west, and the sky above him the particular shade of deep turquoise that belonged specifically to New Mexico in late spring. He was not a man given to dramatic internal monologue, but he was aware, riding that trail, of something being different about this, something that felt like moving toward a thing rather than away from one. He had spent most of his life moving away, out of obligation, out of restlessness, out of the particular emptiness that comes from never building anything that belongs to you. This felt different. He reached the outskirts of Harlan Creek around midday and paused on the low rise above the town to look at it. It was a modest place, a main street with perhaps a dozen buildings, a church at one end and a livery at the other, a scattering of homesteads visible across the flat land around it, patches of green where people had managed to coax water up from the earth. It looked like 100 other small towns in the territory. It also looked like a place where a person could actually root down into the ground and grow something real, if they had a mind to. He rode down into town and tied Button outside the livery, because that was always the first place to go in a new town if you wanted to understand the place quickly. The livery was run by a man named Jonas Sparks, who was old and laconic and regarded Wesley with the level assessment of someone who had been reading strangers for 60 years and had gotten very good at it. Passing through, Jonas asked. "Maybe not," Wesley said. "I am looking for a woman named Sallie Wells." Jonas Sparks looked at him for a long moment without any change of expression. Then he said, "Her place is 3 miles south. Take the fork by the dead cottonwood and follow the fence line." Wesley nodded. "What kind of woman is she?" Jonas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Hardworking," he said finally. "Honest, stubborn as anything, smart. The kind of smart that makes people uncomfortable." Why does it make people uncomfortable? Because she does not pretend to be less than she is to make other people feel larger. Jonas looked back at the horse he had been grooming. "Most people in this town think she asks too much. I think she is the only one around here asking for the right amount." Wesley got back on his horse and rode south. He found the fence line and followed it, and after about half a mile he could see the homestead ahead, a modest but well-kept house, a barn that was old but structurally sound, a kitchen garden to the east side, and beyond that the beginning of a field where recently turned earth showed dark against the dry land around it. Someone had been working very hard here. He could see it in every detail: the carefully mended fence posts, the orderly garden rows, the way the yard around the house was clear of the kind of accumulated debris that gathered around places that were slowly losing heart. He slowed Button to a walk as he came through the gate, and then he saw her. Sallie Wells was in the field, working with a hoe, turning up the soil along a row with the efficient, steady rhythm of someone who had been doing this since before she could remember. She was wearing a blue work dress with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and her hat was pushed back on her head, and she was working with a concentration so complete that she did not hear him until he was almost at the fence that separated the yard from the field. He stopped there and did not announce himself immediately, because he was suddenly and acutely aware that he had ridden 30 miles based on a story told by a man who had never understood her, and that he had no idea at all what he was going to say. She looked up. Her eyes were brown and direct, and they moved over him with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly, a skill acquired not from suspicion but from necessity. He saw her take in the horse the gear the way he was sitting all in about 2 seconds. Then she said, "Can I help you?" "My name is Wesley Whitaker," he said. "I rode from Cimarron. That is a good distance." "It is." She waited. She had a patience about her that was the opposite of passivity. It was the patience of someone who was very comfortable with silence and had no intention of filling it just to make a stranger feel easier. He said, "I heard a story about you. I expect you heard that I am a woman who asks too much." "I heard that you ask for exactly the right things," he said. "I heard that and I thought about it for 3 days. And then I rode to meet you, because I have spent my entire life giving too little of what matters, and I thought perhaps I ought to start somewhere." The silence after he said this was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Sallie Wells looked at him from across the fence with those steady brown eyes, and her expression was not the one he might have expected, neither dismissal nor welcome, but something more careful than either. She was, he could see, thinking about it seriously, taking the measure of what he had said. "That is an unusual thing to say to a stranger," she said. "I know it. Most men ride out here to tell me I am making my life too hard or to suggest they could make it simpler." "I am not here to make your life simpler," he said. "I would not know how and would not try without being asked." Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile but the possibility of one. "Well," she said after another moment, "you have ridden a long way. You had better come in for water at least." He tied Button to the fence post and followed her to the house, and that was how it started. She gave him water and then she gave him coffee, which she made strong and without ceremony, and they sat at the kitchen table across from each other in the honest afternoon light, and she looked at him with the directness that had apparently unsettled every man in the valley, and he looked back at her with the steadiness that had been, most of his life, the only thing he was certain he had to offer. "What do you do, Wesley Whitaker?" she asked. "I have been working cattle drives for 10 years. Before that I was on my family's ranch in Texas, which struggled and eventually failed. And now, I have money saved. I have been considering land." "What kind of land?" "Working land, something I could build on." He paused. "I do not have any yet." She nodded slowly. "And you heard a story about a woman with land who was not interested in the usual arrangement, and you thought what exactly?" He looked at her steadily. "I thought that what you were described as wanting sounded like the only arrangement I would ever actually want either, and I thought that was worth a 30-mile ride to say to your face." Sallie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to be very plain with you because that is how I do things and I find it saves considerable time." "I would prefer that," he said. "I am not looking for a man to save me. I am not in distress. I have a situation that is financially difficult but not impossible, and I am working through it by myself." "I heard that too. I will not give up this land or merge it into someone else's holdings or become a secondary consideration in my own life. That seems reasonable." "It does not seem reasonable to most people around here." "Most people around here have not thought about it carefully enough," he said. She studied him again with that level, considering gaze. "You are either exactly what you appear to be or you are an unusually good liar." "I am generally considered to be a poor liar. My face, apparently, does not cooperate." That got the smile. Not the possibility of one, but the actual thing, brief and real, and it changed her face considerably. Wesley Whitaker felt something in his chest shift again, the same way it had in the saloon in Cimarron 3 days ago, only more so. "I will make you another offer," she said. "I need a hand with the north field this week. The ground is hardened and I have been working it alone, and it is slow going." I cannot pay wages because I do not have them, but I can feed you supper, and if there is work you need done in return, I will do it. I will work your north field, he said. You do not need to offer anything in return. I will offer it anyway, she said, and her tone made clear that this was not a negotiation. He understood then something important about her, that the giving had to go both ways or she would not take any of it. She was not a woman who would accept charity dressed up as help, and she was not a woman who would take without giving. And these two things together meant that any man who came to her with either rescue on one side or an empty hand on the other was going to be turned away, not out of pride, but out of something more principled than that. He worked her north field that afternoon and the following 3 days, rising before dawn at the boarding house in town where he had taken a room, riding out to the Wells homestead with the first light, and working with her through the long spring days until the light went amber and thin in the evenings. She worked beside him, not supervising but actually working, the two of them moving up and down the rows with a rhythm that established itself naturally after the first morning, without either of them having to discuss it. He noticed things about her. The way she moved through the work with absolute competence, knowing exactly what needed to be done and doing it without wasted motion. The way she talked about the land, not as property but as something she had a relationship with, something that required attention and reciprocity. The way she was with the old mare in her barn, a gray horse named Duchess who was 20 years old and moved slowly, and whom Sallie treated with a gentle formality, as if the horse had earned certain courtesies through long service. He noticed the way she argued with him about crop rotation the second afternoon, flat out told him his suggestion was wrong, laid out 3 reasons why, then listened carefully when he pushed back, and in the end said, "All right, that is a fair point. We will try it your way on the west quarter," without any awkwardness about having changed her mind. He found her, in short, to be exactly what the story had suggested, and also considerably more than the story had managed to convey, because the story had been told by a man who didn't understand her and therefore had gotten the basic facts right, but the substance entirely wrong. She was not difficult. She was demanding in the way that anything worth having is demanding, in that she required you to actually show up fully rather than performing a lesser version of yourself and hoping she wouldn't notice. He told her this at the end of the 4th day, when they were leaning on the fence by the north field looking at what they had accomplished together, and the light was going gold across the turned earth. She turned and looked at him and said, "Do you know how long I have been waiting for someone to say that without also adding a but at the end? How long? Since I was about 19 years old and figured out that the men who wanted to court me were really courting the idea of who they thought I should be, rather than who I actually was." They stood in the fading light, and he thought about saying something, and decided the moment didn't need words. After a while she said, quietly, "You are welcome to come back tomorrow if you want to see the west quarter." "I will be here at first light," he said. He rode back to town in the darkening evening, and the cottonwoods along the creek caught the last of the sunset and held it in their new green leaves, and Wesley Whitaker felt something he could not quite name, a kind of warmth in his chest that was different from satisfaction in its quality, more personal than satisfaction, more fragile and more strong at the same time. He came back the next day and the day after that, and by the 2nd week they had fallen into a pattern that felt organic rather than constructed, working together in the mornings, eating a midday meal at the kitchen table, where the conversation ranged widely across topics, arguing about things with a shared pleasure in the arguing that neither of them had anticipated, sitting on the porch in the evenings with coffee, while the sky went through its elaborate nightly performance. He told her about Texas, about his brothers, about the cattle drives that had taken him through a dozen territories and taught him a great deal about the country and very little about himself. He told her about the saving and the not spending and the not knowing what he was saving for, and she listened without interrupting and then said, You have been holding everything in reserve for something you did not believe was actually coming. I suppose that is true. I understand that, she said. I have spent the last 3 years holding myself in reserve in a different way, waiting to see if anyone would come along who would see the whole of me and not ask me to reduce it. I see the whole of you, he said, and his voice was very quiet when he said it, and she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was composed and also somewhat undone. Wesley, she said. Sallie, do not say things like that unless you mean them completely. I mean them completely, he said. I am not a man who says things he does not mean. The night was warm and full of the sound of insects, and the stars over the New Mexico territory were dense and brilliant, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. On a Sunday, about 3 weeks after Wesley first rode to the homestead, Sallie drove her wagon into Harlan Creek for supplies, and Wesley rode alongside her, and the town noticed. Harlan Creek was small enough that every change in the social arrangement was observable from multiple angles simultaneously, and a woman who had famously rejected every suitor for 3 years now appearing on the main street with a calm, quiet stranger riding at her side was the kind of event that generated considerable comment. Hattie Bowman was the first person to speak to them, coming out of the post office with the enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping for this specific development and was gratified to see it manifesting. Sallie Wells, she said, you had better introduce me. Sallie introduced Wesley, who removed his hat and shook Hattie's hand and said something polite about the town. Hattie looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had been postmistress for 20 years and had consequently developed very good instincts about people's characters. You are not from here, she said. No, ma'am, Texas originally, more recently Cimarron. How did you find your way to Sallie's door? I heard a story, he said, about a woman who was described as asking too much. Hattie smiled, a wide, satisfied smile. And what did you think of that description? I thought whoever told the story had it exactly backward. He glanced at Sallie, who was looking at the middle distance with an expression that suggested she was pretending not to be affected by this conversation, and was not entirely succeeding. I thought what she was described as wanting sounded like the only sensible arrangement I had ever heard of. Hattie Bowman said, Oh, I like this one. And Sallie said, Hattie, please. And Wesley found himself smiling in a way that he did not usually find his face doing in public. Not everyone in Harlan Creek was as immediately welcoming as Hattie Bowman. Roy Hendricks, who had proposed to Sallie the year before and still carried the refusal in the particular tight way of a man whose pride has been dented, was in front of the barber shop and watched them pass with a sour expression. And later that afternoon, he made a point of engaging Wesley in a conversation near the livery that was dressed as friendliness, but was actually the sort of territorial assessment that men perform when they feel something they consider theirs has passed to someone else. Roy was a big, broad man with a bluff manner, and a rancher's assurance that his opinions were worth more than other people's simply because he was the one having them. You are the fellow who has been out at Sallie Wells' place, Roy said, leaning against the post in a way that was designed to look casual and only succeeded in looking deliberate. That is right, Wesley said. Good woman, Sallie, complicated but good. Roy looked at him with the considering gaze of someone setting a price. She is going to work a man to death, I will tell you that for free, and she will not give an inch on anything she has decided about. I have found that she changes her mind when given a good reason, Wesley said, and that she gives good reasons herself when she wants you to change yours. Roy blinked, apparently having expected something else. Well, he said after a pause, I just mean to say she is particular. She is particular about the right things, Wesley said pleasantly, and picked up Button's left front hoof to examine the shoe, which was his way of indicating that the conversation was finished. Roy Hendricks walked away and Wesley finished checking all 4 shoes and thought about the conversation. He was not a man given to jealousy or territorial feelings about people, because he had a fundamental respect for the autonomy of other people that made such feelings seem beside the point. But he had noticed the way Roy had said complicated, and the way he had said she will not give an inch. And he thought about the confidence required in a person to be so clearly and comfortably themselves that other people described them as difficult. And he thought that it was one of the things about Sallie Wells that he found most affecting. There was a town dance on the last Saturday of June, held in the barn behind the church, and Hattie Bowman told Sallie 3 times in the days leading up to it that she ought to go and bring that young man of hers, a phrase Sallie corrected each time by saying he was not her young man, and Hattie said she could call it whatever she liked as long as she showed up. She showed up. Wesley was waiting outside the barn when she arrived, having driven her wagon in from the homestead in the early evening, and he had put on a clean shirt and made some effort with his hair. And when he saw her, his expression did the particular thing it did sometimes, going very still in a way that was not blankness but something quite different from blankness, something concentrated. She had worn a dress he had not seen before, a deep green that worked very well with her dark hair and her sun-browned skin, and she had let her hair down from its habitual pins, and it fell in heavy waves past her shoulders. She looked like herself, only more so. Like a version of herself that existed when she did not have to be practical. "You look beautiful," he said, and it came out of him without the self-consciousness that might have accompanied it because, by this point, he had stopped editing himself around her. She had that effect. Being fully direct with her made it natural to be fully direct in general. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Thank you," without any of the deflection women were expected to perform, just plainly and genuinely, accepting the thing as it was offered. They went in and the music was already going. A fiddler and a man with a guitar and a woman at an old upright piano, playing the dance tunes that everyone in the territory knew in their bones. The barn was lit with lanterns and smelled of hay and candle wax, and the warm human press of a small community gathered together. Wesley Whitaker had not danced in years. He was not a man who usually danced, partly because of the reserve he carried and partly because dancing required you to be present in your body in a way that his habit of self-containment resisted. But Sallie took his hand and pulled him onto the floor with the easy confidence of someone who saw no reason to stand at the edge of a thing when you could be in the middle of it. And he found that dancing with her was nothing like dancing alone. She matched his rhythm before he had established one, and they moved together through the reel with a coordination that felt unreasonably natural. And at some point in the third dance she laughed at something he said, and the sound of it, unguarded and genuine, low and real, did something permanent to him. He was in love with her. He had suspected it for about 2 weeks and was now certain. He did not tell her that night. The timing did not feel right, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to say it correctly. And saying it correctly required a moment with the right quality of quietness around it, and the dance was not quiet. But he rode home from the dance alongside her wagon in the silver dark, and when they reached the homestead and he helped her down from the wagon seat, he held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary to assist her descent, and she let him, and they stood very close in the dark by the wagon, and the night was warm and full of the smell of sage. And then she stepped back with the kind of deliberate care that meant she was thinking about it. "Good night, Wesley," she said. "Good night, Sallie." He rode back to town slowly and thought about everything. July came in hot and serious, the way July came in New Mexico, and the crops needed more attention, and the creek ran lower, and Sallie drove herself and her land hard in the way she always did when things got difficult. Wesley had extended his stay at the boarding house month by month without discussing it with anyone, and by now it was simply understood, at least by Hattie Bowman and Jonas Sparks and the other people in town who paid attention, that he was not going anywhere. He had begun doing some work at the livery for Jonas to supplement his savings, which were still substantial but which he had begun thinking about differently. He was thinking about what they could build rather than what he had accumulated. One afternoon in mid-July, he arrived at the homestead to find Sallie sitting on the porch steps with a letter in her hand and an expression on her face that he had not seen there before. She was very still in the way that people are still when they are holding something significant. He tied Button at the fence and came to the porch and sat down on the steps beside her. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. It was from a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Pemberton, and it said, in the dense formal language of legal correspondence, that a creditor holding a portion of the debt on the Wells property, a man named Gerald Sloan who had bought Sally's outstanding debt from Dolph Pruitt at some point in the previous month, was initiating proceedings to claim against the property for the amount owed, plus accrued interest, plus legal fees. The total came to just over $310. Wesley read it twice, then he looked at Sallie. "When did you get this?" "Today's post." Pruitt sold the debt. Apparently, her voice was carefully level. He was within his legal rights to do so. "I did not know he had done it." "This Sloan, do you know him?" "I know of him. He has been acquiring properties in the eastern part of the territory for the past 2 years. He prefers to buy troubled debt and then press for payment quickly, and when payment cannot be made, he takes the land." She paused. "He is very good at what he does." Wesley set the letter down on the step between them. "How long do you have?" "Pemberton says 60 days from the date of the letter." "And the $310? "I cannot produce $310 in 60 days from the harvest," she said flatly. "The north field and the west quarter are planted, but they will not be ready until September, and even a good harvest on those 2 fields will not produce that much saleable crop in time." Wesley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have $310. The silence that followed this statement was extremely specific in its quality. Sallie looked at him. "No," she said. "Sallie, no," she said again with more firmness. "Wesley, I will not have you spend your savings on my debt." "That is not what this is." "What is this then?" "This is my problem, and I will find another way to solve it." "How?" She did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer, and he watched her work through it in real time, the thinking visible in the set of her jaw and the slight movement of her eyes. "There are other creditors in Santa Fe. There are land banks. I can negotiate a repayment arrangement with this Sloan directly." "Sloan does not make arrangements," Wesley said carefully. "If you know of him, you know that. His method is specifically to prevent arrangements." "Then I will find something else." "Sallie." He shifted on the step so he was facing her more directly. "I am not offering to rescue you. I want to say that plainly. I am not the cavalry arriving to solve a problem you cannot solve yourself. You could solve this yourself eventually, and I know that. What I am offering is a loan, with terms, real terms that you would set because it is your debt and your property and your terms that matter." She looked at him for a long time. "You would do that?" "Yes." "Why?" The question was direct and deserved a direct answer, and he gave her one. "Because I want to be part of this," he said. "Because I have been watching you work this land for 2 months, and I have never in my life seen someone with more right to what they have built. Because you are the first person I have ever met in my life who made me understand that the things I was holding in reserve were worth spending." He stopped, and then kept going because he had started and the moment required completion. "And because I am in love with you, Sallie Wells, and I have known it for weeks, and I would very much like the chance to say that to you plainly and have you hear it." The evening light came long and warm across the porch, and somewhere behind the barn the old mare Duchess moved in her paddock, and the cottonwoods along the distant creek moved in a light wind, and Sallie looked at Wesley Whitaker with those steady brown eyes that had looked directly at things her entire life and not once flinched from what they found. "That is a great deal to say on a porch step," she said softly. "It is. I have been practicing." She laughed, that low, genuine laugh. Then she was quiet again, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of someone deciding how to handle something that deserved careful handling. "I have been in love with you," she said finally, "since approximately the 3rd morning you showed up in my north field before sunrise and did not once suggest you were doing me a favor." The relief that moved through him was enormous and unfamiliar, and he let it show on his face. And she saw it and reached out and put her hand over his, and they sat on the porch steps in the warm July evening, and the light went slowly gold around them. They sat there for a long time, and then they talked about the loan with the practical directness that was simply their natural mode together. And Sallie named the terms, which were generous to him and more structured than necessary, because that was how she did things, and he agreed to them. And then they spent another hour on the porch talking about something else entirely. And when he finally rode back to town, the night was full of stars, and he felt more completely present in his own life than he had ever felt before. He gave her the money the following morning in cash, drawn from his account at the Territorial Bank in Cimarron, which required an early ride and some waiting, and he returned to Harlan Creek by midday and brought the bills to Sallie, who counted them with the precision of someone who took financial matters seriously, and then wrote him a note of obligation in her neat hand that spelled out the terms of repayment, and made him sign it, and kept her copy and gave him his. He admired this so much that he told her so, and she said that admiring someone for being careful about money was not as romantic as he seemed to think it was, and he said he found every variety of her carefulness to be romantic, and she told him he was hopeless and made coffee. The letter to Gerald Sloane's lawyer went out by the following week's post, payment in full, and there was a period of about 10 days before the confirmation came back, during which Sallie continued to work and refused to speak about it as if the outcome were already certain, and Wesley thought this was one of the bravest forms of discipline he had ever witnessed, the practice of not borrowing trouble in advance. The confirmation came in late July, and Hattie Bowman herself brought it out to the homestead because she had been in the post office when it arrived and could not quite bring herself to leave it for the regular delivery. She came trotting up the lane in her small buggy with a dignity that was only slightly undermined by the speed she was traveling, and handed the letter to Sallie on the porch. Sallie read it. Then she said, "The debt is cleared." Hattie made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a sob, and pulled Sallie into an embrace, and Wesley stood back and watched the two women and felt something in his chest that was quiet and deep and good. That evening he asked Sallie if he could speak to her seriously, and she said she had never known him to speak any other way, and he said that was fair, and then he said that he had been thinking, and she said that she had also been thinking, and he said, would she mind telling him what she had been thinking, and she said she had been thinking about the future in a very specific way. "What does the future look like?" he asked. "It looks like this land," she said, "but more of it. And it looks like working it with someone who does not consider it a concession to have a partner. I have been thinking about land," he said. "I have money remaining after your loan. There is a parcel east of yours that Jonas Sparks told me came up for sale last month. 40 acres of good grass and a water access. The price is reasonable." She looked at him steadily. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have spent 10 years accumulating resources I was not sure I was allowed to use for myself. And I am saying that I am done with that. I want to buy that parcel. I want it to sit beside your land and not absorb it. I want to build something here." He stopped. "I want to build it with you, if you will have me." "If I will have you," she repeated. "I am asking you to marry me, Sallie, on whatever terms you name, with whatever arrangement you require. With your land staying your land and mine being mine, and both of us deciding together what we do with what is ours. I'm not asking you to become part of my life. I am asking if we can make a life that is genuinely both of ours." The sun was going down in the way it went down in New Mexico, in sheets of color that seemed too extravagant to be real, orange and rose and a deep burning amber, and the mountains to the west held the last of it in their high places long after the valley went dark. Sallie Wells looked at Wesley Whitaker for a long moment in that fading extraordinary light. "Yes," she said. "On those terms, yes." He kissed her then, which was the first time, there in the dying evening light on the porch of her homestead, and it was the kind of kiss that is also a promise, unhurried and certain. The kiss of two people who have thought carefully about what they are doing and have decided that it is exactly right. They were married in September of 1878, 2 days after the harvest came in, which was a good harvest, the north field and the west quarter both producing well in the end, as if the land had decided to reward the determination that had been poured into it all spring and summer. The ceremony was performed by the preacher at the Harlan Creek church, a reasonable man named Reverend Gale, who had always privately admired Sallie Wells and was visibly pleased by the proceedings. Hattie Bowman cried openly and without embarrassment. Jonas Sparks stood in the back and wore his best jacket and shook Wesley's hand afterward with a grip that communicated more than any words would have. Roy Hendricks came to the ceremony because it was a small town, and not coming would have been more conspicuous than coming. He shook Wesley's hand with a good grace that surprised Wesley slightly and said that he hoped they would be happy, and Wesley believed he meant it, at least mostly. Dolph Prout, who had sold Sally's debt to Gerald Sloan, and who had been living with some measure of community disapproval since this fact had become known, came also and was notably subdued, and gave them a set of good kitchen plates that Sallie accepted with a courtesy that neither forgave nor entirely withheld forgiveness, which Wesley thought was exactly the right response. The wedding supper was held at the Wells homestead, which was large enough for the 20-some people who gathered, and someone brought a fiddle and someone else brought a guitar, and the evening went long and warm and happy, and at some point Wesley found himself standing in the kitchen doorway watching Sallie argue cheerfully with Hattie Bowman about the right way to put up green tomatoes, and the argument was animated and affectionate and entirely characteristic of both of them, and he thought, "This is mine. This is real. This is the thing I did not know I was moving toward all those years." He had bought the parcel east of her land in August, and over the fall they fenced the border between the two properties clearly, not as a division but as a definition, two distinct parcels held by two distinct people who were also one household. Wesley built a bunkroom onto the barn so they could take on a hand for the busy seasons, and Sallie put in a root cellar she had been planning for 2 years, and together they laid out plans for a second field that would come into production the following year. The winter of 1878 was cold but not brutal, and they spent it in the way that people who have found the right person spend their first winter together, reading aloud to each other by the fire, arguing about things and not arguing about them, learning the particular grammar of each other's silences. Wesley found that he talked more with Sallie than he had ever talked with anyone, not because she demanded it, but because she was genuinely interested, because she asked questions that assumed he had things worth saying, and this turned out to be the particular kind of invitation his entire adult life had been waiting for without knowing it. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the loneliness of the years after her father died, about the quality of specific mornings, the ones in early spring when the light came in low through the east window and everything felt briefly possible and brief and precious. About the fear she had felt and refused to show, the fear that the town's assessment of her was right, that she had asked too much, that what she wanted was not a reasonable thing to want. It was the most reasonable thing in the world, he told her, one evening in January by the fire, her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, and the snow tapping at the windows. It was so reasonable that I heard a description of it from a man who thought it was ridiculous, and even through his telling of it I could see exactly what you were after and why. What was I after? She asked. You wanted someone to show up for you the same way you show up for everything else, completely, without holding anything back. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, that is exactly it. I am going to keep showing up, he said. I want you to know that. I have spent a long time not understanding what I was for, and I am very clear about it now. She lifted her head and looked at him, and the firelight moved on her face, and she said, I know you will. I have always been able to tell the difference between a man who means what he says and one who means what he wishes he meant. You mean it. I do. I know. She leaned back against him, and the fire burned and the snow came down, and the house was warm and full of the specific good warmth that comes from two people who have found the right place to be. Spring of 1879 came with a wet generosity that made the valley green in a way it had not been for 2 or 3 years, and the planting went well, and the additional field Wesley had cleared over the winter came into production in a modest way that would improve with time. They hired a hand, a young man named Caleb Torres, who was 19 years old and had come up from the south looking for work, and who proved to be a genuinely capable farmer and a pleasant presence. He was quiet and observant, and had the particular dignity of a young man who had been working since he was very young, and had learned to do things well, because doing things well was the only reliable satisfaction available to him. Wesley was aware, watching Caleb work, of something that needed to be said directly and without ceremony. He told Caleb on his second week that the Wells Whitaker property paid the same wage regardless of where a man came from or what he looked like, and that his work would be valued by its quality and nothing else, and if anyone in town said otherwise, he would hear about it from Wesley directly. Caleb had looked at him for a moment with an expression that was very steady and then said, simply, that he appreciated knowing that. It was not a dramatic exchange, but it was a real one, and afterward the whole quality of Caleb's presence on the place relaxed slightly, in the way that a person relaxes when they have been given reason to believe they are in a safe place. Sallie noticed this exchange and said nothing about it until that evening, when she said, "That was the right thing to do. It was the only sensible thing," Wesley said. "Most people do not do it. Most people do not think about it carefully enough," he said. And then, because this was a habit they had developed, turning from the practical to the personal with ease, "How are you feeling?" She looked at him with a smile that was different from her usual smile. "I have been meaning to tell you something," she said. He waited. "We are going to need the second bedroom to serve a new function," she said. He understood her. He sat very still for a moment looking at her, and the thing that moved through him was enormous, a kind of joy with more depth than he had known joy could have. "Sallie," he said. "I believe it will be winter," she said. "Hattie Bowman's sister in Albuquerque is a midwife, and Hattie has already written to her." "Of course she has." "Are you all right?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was more careful than her usual tone, a careful, attentive kind of asking. He got up and went to her and took her hands and held them with more feeling than he usually permitted himself in gesture, and said, "I am better than all right. I am the best I have ever been. Are you?" She looked at him with those honest brown eyes. "Yes," she said. "I am, completely." The summer was a good summer, hard-working and golden, and Sallie continued to work her land with the single-minded dedication that was simply her nature, adjusting as the months went on, and Wesley worked beside her and made himself useful in the specific ways she required, and did not hover or fuss because she had asked him not to hover or fuss, and he respected her enough to take instruction. Caleb Torres proved to be invaluable during the harvest, working with a tirelessness that impressed even Sallie, and she told him so directly, in the way she told people things, plainly and without embellishment, and it clearly meant something to him in the way that direct and genuine praise means something when you have not had a great deal of it. Hattie Bowman came out to the homestead every week and was a consistent source of both practical help and cheerful noise, and Jonah's Sparks brought by a crib in September that he had made himself out of good pine, setting it on the porch without ceremony and refusing any payment, saying only that it had been sitting in his workshop half-finished for 15 years, and it was time it went somewhere useful. Sallie touched the crib's smooth railing and looked at Jonas with an expression that was unusually unguarded. "Thank you, Jonas," she said. "Your father was a good man," Jonas said, which was his way of saying everything else he felt about the matter. December of 1879 arrived cold and clear, and on the 14th of that month, with Hattie's sister Clara present as midwife, Sallie Wells Whitaker gave birth to a son. He came into the world in the early morning hours, loud and vigorous and emphatic about his arrival, and Wesley was in the next room trying not to pace and mostly pacing. And when Clara opened the door and said he could come in, he went in, and there was Sallie in the bed with the infant on her chest, and her hair dark and damp against the pillow, and her face entirely, openly radiant in a way he had never seen it before, stripped of every guard and every practiced composure. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and could not find any words at all for a long moment, which was unprecedented for a man who had, since meeting Sallie, been considerably more verbal than his previous life had trained him to be. "Well," Sallie said softly, watching his face. "He is extraordinary," Wesley said, and his voice came out rougher than usual, with emotion he did not try to contain. "He is very loud," she said, with the warm precision of a woman who had just spent several hours in close company with this specific quality, and was reporting it accurately. They named him James Thomas Whitaker, James for Sallie's father, whose name had been James Wells, and Thomas because Wesley's middle name was Thomas, and he had always quietly liked it better than his first name, a fact he had never told anyone until Sallie, who had extracted it from him one winter evening as part of the ongoing project she had of knowing all the things about him that he had never bothered to share with the world. James Thomas was a robust and spirited infant who shared his mother's absolute conviction that whatever he needed was entirely reasonable and ought to be provided promptly. Wesley, who had expected to find fatherhood bewildering, found instead that it suited him in a complete and unforeseeable way. He had spent his life being useful in service of other people's goals, and this was also service in a sense, but it was service to something that was genuinely, personally his, and the difference was everything. He was also, to his own surprise, exceptionally good at getting the baby to sleep, a skill he could not explain, and which Sallie found both useful and deeply amusing. She would pass him the wailing infant in the small hours of the night with the look of a woman who was gratefully surprised by her own good fortune, and Wesley would walk the baby in slow circuits of the kitchen and hum some half-remembered Texas cattle tune until the crying wound down to silence, and the small weight on his shoulder went heavy with sleep. And then he would stand in the kitchen doorway for a while longer, not quite ready to put the thing down, looking out at the dark New Mexico night with the baby warm against him, and the stars large and clear above the mountains. The spring of 1880 came, and the land continued to grow and be tended, and Caleb Torres came back for his second season and brought a friend from the south, a young man named Marco, who was also 19, and who proved to be a skilled hand with horses in a way that immediately endeared him to Sallie, who loved horses with a seriousness second only to her love of the land. By the time the summer was fully established, the Wells-Whitaker operation had expanded enough that they needed both men, and the small bunkroom in the barn was enlarged to accommodate this. Wesley bought another 20 acres to the north in the summer of 1880, a dry and rocky parcel that looked unpromising but which he had studied carefully and believed had better water access than was immediately obvious. He and Caleb spent the better part of that summer digging, and proved him right, and by autumn the north parcel had water that would sustain another field the following year. Sallie watched all of this with the satisfaction of a person who had bet on the right thing and seen it confirmed. She told him, one afternoon while they were surveying the north parcel together with James on her hip, that the land was better than it had been 2 years ago. She meant this practically, and he understood it practically. "It is better because it is being worked properly," he said. "It is better because it is being worked by people who give a damn about it," she corrected, and shifted James on her hip and pointed out a specific place where the water table was likely to run, and they talked about it in the technical and engaged way they talked about the land, which was always also a conversation about the future, about what they were building and what they intended it to be. The future, as it turned out, continued to unfold in the way that good futures do when they are built on honest foundations. Hattie Bowman remained a constant and beloved presence in their lives. Jonas Sparks grew older and slower, and eventually sold the livery to a young man from Colorado and spent more time in his workshop, where he proved to be an extraordinarily talented carpenter of small things, boxes and toys, and furniture of a quality that people came from the neighboring towns to purchase. Dolph Pruitt's store changed hands in 1881 when Dolph retired and his son took over, and the son was a different sort of man, more reasonable and less governed by the social hierarchies his father had observed, and he extended credit to Sallie Whitaker on the same terms he extended it to everyone else, which was all she had ever asked for. Gerald Sloan, who had tried to take Sallie's land through purchase debt, made an attempt on another property in the territory the following year and ran into the territory's newly appointed land commissioner, who was interested in exactly these kinds of transactions and less charitably disposed toward them than his predecessor had been. The legal difficulties that followed were extensive and not productive for Mr. Sloan's business interests, and he was not thereafter a significant concern in the valley. Roy Hendricks eventually married a woman from Albuquerque named Helena, who turned out to be, by all accounts, a person of strong opinions and clear preferences, and who appeared to be making Roy considerably happier than he had been in the years he had spent nursing his wounded pride. Sallie ran into Roy at the general store one afternoon in the summer of 1881, and they spoke with the easy courtesy of people who had passed through a complicated history and arrived at a comfortable distance. "Your place is looking well," Roy said, with genuine rather than performative appreciation. "It is," Sallie agreed. "How is Helena?" "Magnificent," Roy said, with the look of a man who meant it absolutely, and something in that look made Sallie think that perhaps Roy Hendricks had finally met someone who made the same kind of demands she had, the reasonable, important, uncompromising ones, and that it was doing him a great deal of good. In the autumn of 1881, the harvest was the best the Wells Whitaker land had ever produced, the new north field coming in well as Wesley had predicted, the original fields performing at their peak. The debt Sallie had carried, the loan from Wesley that had saved the land in 1878, had been paid back in full by the spring of 1880, with the interest Sallie had set, and when the final payment was made, she had presented it to him with a formality that was entirely her own, the promissory note she had written in her careful hand, marked paid in full, and folded it into his breast pocket herself. He had pulled the note out and looked at it and said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it," he said. She kept the copy of the promissory note in a box in the bedroom, along with her father's watch and the letter her mother had written her the year before she died, and the pressed wildflower that Wesley had put in her hand the morning of their wedding, saying nothing, just pressing it into her palm as they walked to the church. The box contained all the things she considered the actual record of her life, the real documents of what had mattered. By the winter of 1882, James Whitaker was a vigorous 3-year-old with his mother's direct brown eyes and his father's quiet attentiveness, already following them both around the property, with the intense interest of a child who understands that important things are being done and intends to be involved. He had opinions about everything, expressed with a confidence that was entirely hereditary, and he had a specific friendship with Caleb Torres, who had remained with them year after year, and had become as permanent a part of the Wells Whitaker operation as the fence posts or the water access to the north field. Caleb had saved enough in his years with them to send money home to his family in the South, and in the spring of 1882, his mother and his younger sister came north to the territory, settling in a small house in Harlan Creek that Caleb had helped arrange for them. His mother, Maria Torres, was a woman of 50 with the same quiet steadiness as her son, and she and Sallie took to each other with the immediate ease of people who recognized the same quality of endurance in each other. Maria began doing some work in Hattie Bowman's post office, which Hattie had been needing help with for years, and the arrangement suited both of them well. It was Maria Torres who told Sallie, one afternoon in the spring of 1882, when they were sitting on the porch of the Whitaker homestead with coffee and the warm, indolent sound of bees in the kitchen garden, that she had heard the story of how the Wells land had almost been lost and how it had been saved. "I heard you were described as a woman who asked too much," Maria said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone repeating something rather than endorsing it. "I was," Sallie said. "And your husband rode to find you because of it." "He did." Sallie looked out at the land, at the new green of the fields and the clean line of the fence posts, and the barn with its repaired siding and the second corral Wesley and Caleb had built the previous fall. He said he had been giving too little his entire life. And now? Sallie looked back at Maria Torres and allowed herself, in the full sun of a spring afternoon with everything she had worked for visible and present around her, a smile that was not any of her careful smiles, not the controlled one or the amused one or the particular one she kept for people she trusted. It was the one she only showed entirely when there was no reason left to guard it. "Now," she said, "he gives exactly enough of exactly the right things. And so do I." Maria Torres nodded as if this was the only answer that made any sense, which it was, and they sat in the sun together and drank their coffee, and the bees worked the garden, and the spring day moved over the New Mexico territory in the long, unhurried way of spring days that know there is time enough for everything. Wesley came back from the north field in the late afternoon, dusty and tired, and came up onto the porch and bent, and kissed the top of Sallie's head in the way he had developed of doing it, the particular domestic tenderness of a man who had been away for a few hours and is glad to be back. And Sallie reached up without looking and touched his hand briefly, and the whole exchange lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained more than most people manage to say in an hour. "Good afternoon, Maria," he said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitaker. How is the garden?" He looked at the rows with the professional assessment he gave to all growing things. "The tomatoes are behind," Sallie said. "But the beans are doing what they like." "I will look at the tomatoes tomorrow," he said, and went inside to wash up, and James followed him in making enthusiastic claims about something important that had happened with a frog near the water trough, and the screen door banged behind them both. And Sallie smiled at Maria Torres again, and Maria Torres smiled back. The following year brought another good season and another child, a daughter this time, born in the summer of 1883 and named Eliza Jane Whitaker, for Wesley's mother and Sallie's grandmother, which was a negotiation that had taken an enjoyable amount of time and resulted in a compromise both of them considered excellent. Eliza was small and fierce from the first hour, and James regarded her with the intense and slightly bewildered fascination of a 4-year-old who has been told this is going to be wonderful and is in the process of deciding whether he agrees. He decided he agreed about 2 weeks in, when Eliza first grabbed his finger with her entire fist and held it with the grip strength of someone who had strong opinions about what she intended to keep. After that, he was devoted in the specific and slightly overwhelming way of older children who have decided a younger sibling is their personal responsibility. The homestead was full now, full in the good way, with the particular productive noise of a place that has found its right state. The land was healthy. The debts were clear. The work was shared and valued. Every person on the property, from Sallie and Wesley to Caleb and young Marco to the seasonal hands who came and went, understood that they were part of something that functioned as a whole, that every contribution mattered and was recognized as mattering. Hattie Bowman visited every week until the week she could not, which came in the winter of 1884 when she took ill with a lung sickness that the doctor from Cimarron said was beyond what he could treat. Sallie sat with her in the small house behind the post office for 3 days, along with Hattie's husband Bernard and their grown son, and held her hand and talked with her. And Hattie said, 2 days before the end, that she was content with things, which was not nothing, which was in fact a great deal, to be able to say with truth that you were content with things. Sallie grieved her the way she grieved things, with a thoroughness and a private quality that did not diminish with time, but rather settled into the texture of the days, becoming part of the landscape of who she was. She kept Hattie's most direct words in the box in the bedroom. She thought of her every spring when the cottonwoods went green. The post office passed to Bernard Bowman, and eventually to Maria Torres, who ran it with a quiet efficiency that Hattie would have approved of entirely. Wesley Whitaker, in the years that followed, built the North Field into the most productive acreage on the Wells Whitaker property, which gave him a satisfaction that was not about the money, but about the prediction confirmed, the long, patient work of reading the land and being right about what it could do. He had, over the years, developed the particular deep knowledge of the specific land that only comes from years of daily attention, the way certain plants held the soil, the behavior of the water in the dry months, the wind patterns across the flat land east of the mountains. He knew this land. It was his, personally and specifically, the way it can only be yours if you have worked it with your hands and thought about it with your whole mind. Sallie knew all of this about him, the way she knew all the things about him that he had spent a lifetime not knowing how to share. She knew his quiet and his expressiveness, his stubbornness on certain subjects and his genuine openness on others. She knew that he still, after all these years, occasionally looked at the homestead with an expression she could only describe as wondering, as if he still found it somewhat remarkable that he had arrived here and stayed and been allowed to belong to something this real. She told him this one evening in the late summer of 1885, the two of them sitting on the porch in the warm dark after the children were in bed and the day's work was done, and the stars were doing their extravagant New Mexico thing above the mountains. She said, "You still look at this place like you are surprised to be here." He thought about this for a moment. "Not surprised," he said. "Grateful." "You do not have to be grateful, Wesley. You built it too." "I know I did," he said. "That is what I am grateful for, that I was allowed to build it, that I came when I did and you took a chance on an unknown man who had spent 30 miles thinking about a story he'd heard." She looked at him with those eyes that had looked directly at things her entire life. "I took a chance on you because you were honest about what you were," she said, "from the very first conversation. You were honest about what you were first. I had practice," she said dryly. "It was either be honest or disappear." He reached over and took her hand in the dark. "I am very glad you did not disappear." "I am very glad," she said, "that you rode to find me." The night was warm and quiet, and somewhere out in the dark the land stretched away in every direction, the land she had held through difficulty, and the land he had bought and built, all of it tended and growing under the big New Mexico sky, and the two of them sat on the porch they had extended together the previous summer and held hands in the dark, and were, without any complication or reservation, entirely happy. James grew into a boy of serious purposes and easy laughter, quick at numbers in a way that pleased Sallie, and at the mechanics of things in a way that delighted Wesley, and he showed every indication of becoming someone who would neither ask too little of the world nor accept too little from it. Eliza grew into a child who could argue any position into the ground by the time she was 5, a quality that her parents regarded with a combination of exhaustion and enormous pride. Caleb Torres, in 1886, married a woman named Rosa from the South, a school teacher who came to Harlan Creek when the town finally established a proper school, and they settled into a small house on the edge of town that Caleb had bought with his savings, and the wedding was attended by the entire Wells Whitaker household with the warmth and ceremony due to someone who had become family over 8 years of shared work. The school that Rosa Torres taught was the kind of school Sallie had always wanted to exist in Harlan Creek, one that taught the children of the valley regardless of where they came from, which was not a position everyone in town agreed with, but which was the position of the school's largest donor, which happened to be the Wells Whitaker property, and which Sallie argued for at every town meeting with the same pleasant inexorable logic she brought to all matters she had decided were right. She was still described by some as a woman who asked too much. She had long since stopped finding this anything but mildly amusing. She asked for exactly what was reasonable, and she always had, and the evidence of that was visible in every direction from the porch of her homestead, in the healthy fields and the well-kept fences and the two children growing up knowing their worth, and in the man beside her who had ridden 30 miles on a gamble and proven to be, in every way that mattered, exactly enough and more. Wesley Whitaker, for his part, had stopped being surprised by his own happiness in approximately the same year James learned to walk, which was when the permanence of it became undeniable. He had stopped giving too little, not all at once but gradually, the way old habits change when they are replaced by something better, something that fits the actual shape of who you are rather than the shape that fear had built. He gave his thoughts, his work, his presence, his time, his whole self, and found that the giving did not diminish anything but rather accumulated, compounding the way good things do when they are given somewhere worthy. He thought sometimes, rarely and briefly, about the man he had been before he rode to Harlan Creek, the man in the corner of the Cimarron saloon listening to Pete Dobbins and feeling something shift in his chest. He was grateful for that shift. He was grateful that he had listened to it rather than putting it away in the reserve where he had kept everything else for so long. He was grateful that he had gotten on his horse in the early morning dark and ridden southwest through the sage and the high grass with the mountains large to the west. He had ridden to find her, and he had found everything. The autumn of 1886 settled over the New Mexico territory with the long golden patience of a season that knows it has earned its beauty. The cottonwoods going bright yellow along the creeks, and the mountains wearing their first snow above the tree line, and the sky the particular deep blue that belonged to autumn in this country in a way it belonged to nowhere else. The harvest was in, and the accounts were settled, and the root cellar was full, and the north field had been put to bed for winter in the way that Wesley and Caleb had developed together over the years, the particular careful process of a man who understood his land and did right by it. James Whitaker, 7 years old, was sitting in the kitchen doing figures with the concentrated intensity of his mother, and Eliza, 3 years old, was sitting beside him not doing figures but narrating something complicated to the cat, who was listening with the polite skepticism of a long-established household pet. Wesley came in from the barn and Sallie was at the stove, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the scene, and the feeling that moved through him was the same feeling it always was and was always new. Gratitude and gladness and the specific deep warmth of a man who has come home to the right place and knows it without any remaining doubt. Sallie turned from the stove and looked at him and said, "You are standing in the door again." "I like the view from the door," he said. She pointed at the table. "Sit down, you are letting the cold in." He sat down. Eliza transferred her monologue from the cat to her father without losing any momentum. James showed him the figures he was working. Sallie brought food to the table and sat across from him, and the family ate supper in the kitchen of the homestead in the golden autumn evening, with the warmth of the stove and the smell of the food, and the sound of 2 children making the particular noise of children who are safe and loved and full of opinions. And outside the window the cottonwoods were golden, and the mountains were white above the tree line, and the sky was deepening toward dark. Sallie looked at Wesley across the table and he looked at her, and they did not say anything, and they did not need to. The whole of it was already said, in every year of the life they had built together. In every morning she had gotten up and worked her land, and every morning he had risen before first light and ridden out and come back. In the debt that had been paid, and the land that had been kept, and the children that had been born, and the friend that had been buried, and the school that had been built, and all the days between. The ordinary working extraordinary days of 2 people who had found each other, when they were both ready to give the right amount of the right things. The story that had been told about Sallie Wells, the story that said she asked too much, had grown into a different kind of story in the years since. Not one that traveled through saloons, but one that could be seen plainly in the land that was still hers, and the life that was genuinely both of theirs. It was the story of a woman who had known her worth before anyone had offered to confirm it, who had waited without desperation, and held herself without diminishment, and said plainly what she needed and had been, in the end, entirely right to say it. And it was the story of a man who had heard that story from the wrong kind of teller and understood it correctly anyway, who had sat in a corner of a saloon in Cimarron, New Mexico, on a Wednesday evening in May of 1878, and felt something move in his chest, and listened to what it was telling him, and gotten on his horse in the dark. He had ridden 30 miles on the strength of a description and the quality of his own long-delayed reckoning. He had arrived at a fence and seen a woman working in a field with the focused competence of someone who had never needed saving, but would allow being joined. He had said the honest thing instead of the easier thing. He had offered what he actually had rather than what he thought was wanted. It had been enough, more than enough. It had been the beginning of the only life he had ever wanted, present and full and his own, built with both hands alongside someone who had always known this was possible and had simply been waiting for a man brave enough to believe the same. The autumn evening deepened outside the window, and the kitchen was warm, and the children were arguing now about something involving the cat and who had proprietary rights to it. And Sallie reached across the table and touched Wesley's hand briefly, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the fire in the stove spoke softly to itself, and the mountains outside held their snow in the gathering dark, and everything that had been built was here and real and good, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.